Test 1 2 3 1 2.
Unless you speak 1 hour,
Opening session में opening
I will not allow you to speak 1 hour.
alphabetically कर
So, in principle, yes, because we are having just a welcome
This one?
words, everything. Well, it will be a bit later, no? It will not be 36, but it will be maybe
It is,
probably a
for the
quarter
time
to-
being, it is not
four.
working. When
Yeah, but now
interpretation,
I want to put it the link here.
Sorry?
The interpretation.
yeah, no,
Yes,
it
because
is
there
not
will be the
available.
people taking. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The second session is about to start. I ask you kindly take your seat so that we can begin on time, please. Can you take a seat, please? Good afternoon. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my dear friends, I now announce the start of Session 2 on preventing and countering violent extremism conducive to terrorism in Africa, experiences and good practices. This is a timely theme, and I am very pleased to deliver from my capacity as High Representative of the United Nations Alliance of Civilization. Good afternoon. I hope that siesta is not going to prevail and you will be attentive to this panel and that we can really engage all together. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my dear friend, it's for me a great pleasure to be back in Kenya, such an important and leading country in the world in Africa. But now as my new capacity of High Representative of the United Nations Alliance of Civilization, and to share with you some thought on one of the most, let's say, important and challenging issues in today's international agenda, counter-terrorism, and how to counter violent extremism conducive to terrorism in Africa. My dear friend, terrorism in all forms of violence, leading to acts of terror, is an affront to the three pillars of the United Nations, namely international peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. Despite progress made in many areas, acts of terror unfortunately continue to strike everywhere and everyone, reminding us every day that no country is immune nor safe. I don't wish to repeat what we have already heard this morning from the distinguished speakers in the opening session. But we should remain vigilant as foreign fighters are relocating in other countries. We also noted that terrorism is a transnational threat that operates simultaneously. This means that no one country can defeat it alone. A more holistic approach is needed, and we have heard from all interveners this morning that that is the way to combat terrorism. An approach that makes full use of hot power political tools and complements law enforcement, military solutions, and security measures. That is the reason why the United Nations Alliance of Civilization, the UN entity that I'm privileged to lead since January 2019, has recognized since its creation 15 years ago after the terror attack in Madrid in 2004, that identifying and addressing the root causes or the drivers of violent extremism when conducive to terrorism is key to prevention. Unresolved conflict and new emerging conflict, lack of opportunity, exclusion, inequality, discrimination, and serious violation of human rights underline few of the root causes for acts of violent extremism conducive to terrorism. We have also realized that intercultural and interreligious dialogue is a powerful tool, but often it is neglected. Dialogue is a sine qua non that is capable of breaking the walls of ignorance and building bridges of understanding, respect, and acceptance, injecting the spiritual and religious component in conflict resolution, complements and enriches other approaches. However, my dear friends, dialogue should not be the sole prerogative of theologians, of anthropologists. Dialogue should be inclusive, aiming at realizing Goal 16 of the GDG. We continue to carve our space for community leaders, municipalities, civil society, youth grassroots, and women to engage in interreligion and intercultural dialogue in order to support efforts in the prevention of conflict, radicalization, and building social cohesion and resilience. At UNOSC, we work with youth and for youth, mobilizing the transformative power while emphasizing at the same time that they are game changers rather than victims, as Aya Chevy was telling us this morning. The United Nations Alliance of Civilization is a member of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Coordination Compact, co-organized a side event with other partners, including UN entities and civil society. The theme focused on countering and preventing violent extremism through communication and empowerment strategy involving youth. Panelists from Finland, Jordan, the Institute of Strategic Dialogue share details of the respective project on youth engagement for preventing violent extremism, including evidence-based approaches and creative use of online video dramas and music to appeal to the youth. We wanted to demonstrate that UNOSC firmly believes that all of government, all of society, all of UN approach is the ideal approach to preventing and countering terrorism, involving a broad range of partners at national, regional, and global level. Meanwhile, Africa has been, as it still is, in the front line in terms of its global struggle against terrorism. Kenya, unfortunately, has suffered this hideous attack at the beginning of this year. Since January, about a dozen African countries, including Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Libya, Mali, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Somalia, have suffered terror attacks in which thousands of civilians have been killed. In most of these terrorist attacks from extremist and terrorist groups, no clear political, religious, or local goals were identified. As part of my new mission for the Alliance, I'm planning to launch several initiatives in East, West, and Central Africa to support peace building and reconciliation efforts. Nevertheless, religious sites as what we call soft target. Religious sites are having a special symbolism, and that was the reason why, after the aftermath of the heinous attack in Christchurch, New Zealand, the United Nations Secretary General requested me to develop a plan of action to explore action to prevent attacks and, most importantly, guarantee the safety of worshippers to practice their rituals in peace. The Secretary General asked me to reach out to governments, religious leaders, faith-based organizations, and other relevant stakeholders to ensure that the plan contains concrete and action-oriented recommendations that can help ensure that religions are going to be considered in a positive manner. And in this endeavor, I want that Africa played its particular role. In that reason, I am preparing with the government of Equatorial Guinea to organize a conference in the fall in order to implement when we will approve the action plan to safeguard religious sites, dedicated exclusively to Africa continent. Let me conclude by saying that we have in front of us the possibility of exchanging experiencing good practices and using this soft power in order to understand better how we can counter this hideous attack. Concluding, I look forward to learning from all of you as I listen to your experiences, good practices, and lessons learned. So now I will give the floor to my dear co-chairman, Mr. Mokhtar Ben Nasser, and I invite my colleague to address his floor to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Je vais m'exprimer en français.
I will be speaking French today. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I should like to use this opportunity to commend the government of Kenya and the United Nations who organized this most important seminar. It is an honor for me to be co-chairing this panel today, focused on preventing and countering extremism, violent extremism, conducive to terrorism. In my introductory remarks, I want to sketch out the broad contours of the efforts Tunisia has been making to combat violent extremism and terrorism. I'll be telling you a little bit about the legal framework, the institutions we've set up, and the national strategy for combating terrorism and preventing violent extremism. In 2011, the revolution occurred in Tunisia, a major change which brought to the fore a lot of freedom and democracy. But with it, it brought terrorism. Before the revolution, prior to the revolution, we had a number of terrorist attacks. They were sporadic, one-off, with long intervals. Following the revolution, we saw growing numbers of attacks. In 2011, we had one incident. And then by 2015, we had roughly a dozen terrorist attacks per year. So roughly a dozen per year, whereby terrorists have spread terror. Starting in 2011, we had terrorist attacks targeting military and security forces, as well as politicians, the tourism sector, and the civilian population. Tunisia began by building national capacity, security and military capacity, equipping ourselves, investing in national cooperation, but also regional and international collaboration efforts. Thanks to these military and security efforts, we've managed to neutralize a number of terrorists, as well as to thwart the efforts of a number of cells planning attacks. We broke down those cells. Nonetheless, we still have our work cut out for us. And for that reason, we decided to adopt a comprehensive approach. We began by overhauling the legal and institutional framework. We adopted a law which introduces a lot of changes, all with a view to combating this scourge. We did have a 2003 law in this sphere, but it was not human rights compliant. Therefore, the law adopted on 7th of August 2015 seeks to combat terrorism and money laundering. This piece of legislation set up a framework for this battle. The Tunisian Commission for Financial Analysis, part of the central bank, was set up, and there's a financial intelligence unit within it conducting administrative work. We also created an institutional framework for combating terrorism, which I chair. It's part of the government, and it assists our national efforts targeting the battle against terrorism and violent extremism. We also have a special hub for combating terrorism, which is part of the Court of Appeal in Tunisia. The National Commission is made up of 22 members from various ministries, all of the ministries. The presidency is held by the President, the Ministry of Justice, the Vice Presidency, and then there are many experts who are part of the committee, and on occasion, we invite civil society representatives to the Commission's meetings. The Commission has a number of mandated objectives: strategic missions, regulatory missions, awareness-raising activities, and consultation activities. But on the whole, it serves as a mechanism for coordinating the efforts of ministries, civil society, and local government. The National Strategy for Combating Extremism and Terrorism was devised following a National Security Council decision in February of 2015. This national strategy for combating extremism and terrorism was drafted and then endorsed in November of 2016. The President of the Republic signed it. It's underpinned by 4 pillars: prevention, protection, prosecution, and response. It requires good governance, respect for the rule of law, and human rights. This is a multidimensional approach, and it is also a multi-actor approach involving many different stakeholders. So in order to implement this strategy, what we did is we went to the ministries and asked them to draft plans of action. Part of this process involved holding workshops. At those workshops, plans of action were devised, in other words, blueprints, which we then went on to implement. Prevention. Prevention means preventing and combating radicalization, terrorist recruitment, and basically stripping them of their means of action. We looked at infrastructure, potential targets. We made them less vulnerable to terrorist attacks by beefing up border security, transport security, the security of critical infrastructure. In addition to which, we also introduced private protection opportunities, including in the tourism sector. So we tried to scupper terrorists' ability to plan and execute terrorist acts. We brought to justice these terrorist actors by building human capacity and also the logistical capacity of both the state and other groups. Part of the answer, part of the solution, is laying the groundwork for standing up to the terrorist threat and addressing its repercussions. This speaks to the topic of this session. In fact, there are 3 key components as part of this pillar. First of all, the public at large, the media. We need to turn public opinion against extremists, uniting Tunisians around one objective: solidarity, social peace, accepting one another. Also, there are some vulnerable groups who are susceptible to being enlisted: young people, high school students, young people who are unemployed, but also women and children. We, in fact, have a specialized program for ex-convicts, so those who have served their sentence. How do we address this challenge? What do we do with these people? Considering the fact that Tunisian society, in fact, does not welcome these foreign terrorist fighters who've come back to Tunisia, who've served their sentence. What do we do with them? Very often, Tunisian society doesn't want them to come back into the country and actually wants us to revoke their citizenship. In order to implement the plans drafted by the ministries, the Commission set up a number of partnerships. In other words, we're counting on our bilateral partners. We have bilateral partnerships with a number of countries. Also, we have initiatives such as GSURF, Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, and we're, of course, cooperating closely with the various UN entities, NGOs, and other international agencies. So, putting this into action, translating this into action on the ground, requires us to cooperate with civil society. That's the first thing. It also requires civil society organizations, NGOs, to commit themselves to this battle, and we also work with the private sector. A great deal of work is being done at the grassroots level on the ground to prevent violent extremism. It is, of course, an ideological battle. Those who have picked up arms do require military response. They need to be brought to justice, but there's also the response to all the indoctrination work that's going on. The Ministry of Education, the Ministry for Young People's Affairs, the Ministry for Social Affairs, Ministry of Religious Affairs. They're also coming up with plans, counter-narratives, and most recently, we set up a platform for these counter-narratives, which seek to contest terrorist narratives. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, my dear friend, Your Excellency, Mr. Ben Nasser, for his insightful remarks, elaborating on the important role that the National Counter-Terrorism Commission in Tunisia in terms of coordinating and monitoring counter-terrorism action between the different ministries in Tunisia. By the way, I'm not Mr. Mokhtar Ben Nasser, I'm Mr. Moratinos. It's not Mr. Moratinos, it's Mr. Mokhtar Ben Nasser. But you will not confuse ourselves. He's more bright than me, you know, so. So anyhow, let's start with the panelists. Let me first do some housekeeping announcement. For the 4 distinguished members of this panel, they will make their presentation from their seat. Each will speak for a maximum of 6 minutes. Try to do so. The members of the panel and the speaker from the floor are urged to strictly observe the time limit because, in a sense, our panel is diversified. It will bring us different views of counterterrorism effort from the lens of government, civil society, and intergovernmental organizations. So, let's start with the first panelist, His Excellency, Mr. Brian Ashampong, Minister of State for National Security of Republic of Ghana. I open and I give the floor, Your Excellency, to address the audience. Thank you, Mr. Ashampong.
Thank you, co-chairs Miguel Moratinos and Ben Nasser. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I present to you a summarized version of Ghana's perspective on the prevention and countering of violent extremism in Ghana. This is a summarized version because of the time as read out by Mr. Moratinos. Even though Ghana is not a terrorist hub in our assessment, groups associated with Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State of Libya, and the Islamic State of West Africa present a threat to it and the region. We are in a neighborhood of action. A lot of the countries around us are going through and dealing with various armed groups. Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina, Mali, Nigeria. We are particularly aware what happened when ISIL lost its legitimacy in Iraq and Syria. They advised their followers and sympathizers to carry out attacks in their home countries and not to travel to destinations because it was no longer safe and lucrative. We take this directive that they gave to their members seriously, and therefore, even though we, in our assessment, think that we are not a hub, we cannot assume to be safe. Ghana's National Security Ministry has taken notice of this directive and have adopted strategies to deal with the situation more aggressively. Our experiences thus far. You may be aware that some Ghanaians, both male and females, traveled to join terrorist organizations in Libya and Syria. Some have been captured, declared missing, others have been killed. Notable among them is Mohamed Nazar Alema Nortey, a university student who was recruited by ISIS but now confirmed dead in Syria. My country's security and intelligence agencies have also worked on suspected terrorist financiers, radicalizers, and sympathizers who have officially crossed into our ports. Our security agencies are aware of the several suspected religious NGOs who facilitated the movement of these young men and women into Syria and Libya. Our experiences also at the border is something worth mentioning. We border Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire on our northern end, and we all know the kind of actions that are going there. We have deployed a lot of troops and intelligence officers at the borders. We have also deployed tools to ensure that none of these actions cross into our territory. Some good practices that we have implemented and learned. The international community has increasingly underscored the need for an all-inclusive approach to countering the spread of terrorism and violent extremism. A whole society approach aimed through a wide range of mostly non-coercive activities to address the root cause that may ultimately result in violent extremism and act of terrorism is very imperative. This element aims to reduce the attractiveness of terrorist messages and to defend vulnerable groups from it. It involves a wide range of programs and activities that require actions from government and civil society working together. The initiatives under this element include countering the terrorist narratives and ideology by producing effective counter-narratives, identifying vulnerable individuals or groups before they progress too far towards violent extremism, and addressing, of course, the socioeconomic and governance challenges that encourage the growth of violent extremism. Ghana has created forums for interreligious and intercultural dialogue and platforms with non-governmental organizations, actors, to help counter violent extremism. Similar steps have been taken in the field of education and religion. Countering violent extremism measures have also included initiatives for counter-messaging and the use of social media and other communication channels to counter their narratives and to produce alternative and promote these alternatives based on respect for human rights and dignity. Our security agencies, acting through a unified command, and this is something that I want to re-emphasize. It used to be that our various security agencies were not talking to each other. But when terrorism became an issue, we now have a unified command to deal with it. We have been able to assemble personnel both at the tactical and operational levels in all our relevant stakeholder institutions. These tactical and operational units have received extensive training from the African Union, our friends, the Americans, the African Center for Strategic Studies, the United Nations, and the George Marshall Center in Germany. This is all help aimed at building their capacity to be able to deal with violent extremism. The government of Ghana is in the process of beefing up the security and intelligence agencies with state-of-the-art gadgets to be able to disrupt, arrest, and fight the activities of suspected terrorists. And the key word here is beefing up, because we already have some tools that at least is helping us fight the menace thus far. Co-chairs, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, radicalizers and groomers that we have identified in our state and those who prey on the vulnerabilities and recruit people for these acts of violent extremism are being dealt with through formal structures. Like in our country, we have a national chief imam who is the head of all the Muslim religious groups in Ghana, church leaders, and then, of course, the relevant institutions that matter in dealing with sensitization. We have been able to have, for now, a hold on those individuals, and we have proper state institutions dealing with them. So far, initiatives for countering incitement and violent extremism can take many forms. Common to all these methods is an emphasis on dialogue, inclusion, and the promotion of understanding. One of Ghana's counter-terrorism national response pillar, PREVENT, deals with measures to prevent terrorist attacks by addressing the root cause, minimizing vulnerability, and building resilience. In conclusion, the Ghana government has taken a lot of initiatives together with the private sector, civil society organizations aimed at preventing extremism, which can be conducive to terrorism. This collective initiative seeks to prevent radicalization, recruitment, mobilization of individuals into terrorist groups, and becoming foreign terrorist fighters. By all these measures, the general citizenry will be able to identify a terrorist suspect, a recruiter, what to do when sighted, and how to respond when there is a terrorist attack in the unlikely event. These are the things that we are doing in our country to prevent terrorism and end violent extremism. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Honorable Minister Brian Asampon. I really appreciate your remark, and I recall reading in one of your newspapers that Your Excellency called for a meeting with the regional leader in Ghana, and I think the Alliance of Civilization could work with you in order to continue to work together in this area. Thank you for your comment and the engagement of your country in these counter-terrorism activities. Now let's move in from government to the experience of an intergovernmental authority. Thus, for that, I invite Mr. Abebe Mulune, Head Security Sector Program, Intergovernmental Authority on Development of IGAD, to deliver his remark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Your Excellencies, distinguished party participants, colleague panelists, observed protocols, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of His Excellency Ambassador Engineer Mahabub Maalim, Executive Secretary of IGAD, and myself, I am very honored and privileged today to present the IGAD Counter-Terrorism and Countering and Preventing Violent Extremism approach. At this point in time, I am humbly thanking the Republic of Kenya for hosting and co-organizing this very important high-level conference with the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Office. It is unfortunate that IGAD region is a source, transit, and destination of wide range of emerging, evolving, and existing transnational security threats. These threats are interlinked and interconnected by actors, space, enabling infrastructure, and impact. The security architecture of IGAD has evolved significantly over the past decade, but the nature and variety of transnational security threats has been evolving even faster. The security landscape in the IGAD region faces a multiplicity of transnational security threats, including terrorism, which is international and regional one, violent extremism, and other forms of serious organized crime like human trafficking, arms trafficking, drug trafficking, and others. The growing sophistication and complexity of extremists and criminal groups is supported by international financial networks. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, IGAD and its member states critically recognized the threat of terrorism that led them to the establishment of IGAD capacity building program against terrorism, which was also known as ICPAT in 2006 in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa. ICPAT main focuses was on building member states' capacity to resist terrorism and to promote regional security cooperation through enhancing judicial capacity, optimizing interdepartmental cooperation, enhancing border control, training, information sharing, and best practices, and promoting strategic cooperation. At that time, I was lucky just to work with Dr. Ambassador Martin Kimani together on this office. Pursuant to IGAD's 2009 and subsequent peace and security strategies, IGAD adopted a comprehensive, which means criminal justice and soft approach. Some say hard and soft approach, but we said it criminal justice approach and soft approach to address the multiple and complex transnational security threats such as terrorism and violent extremism. This is implemented in the principle of complementarity under the two critical specialized institutions, that is IGAD Security Sector Program, which is located in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and IGAD Center of Excellence for Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism that is located in Djibouti. The IGAD Security Sector Program addressing transnational security threats in a very holistic and comprehensive manner to encounter the highly interlinked threats of terrorism, transnational organized crime, and maritime insecurity to enable member states and IGAD to effectively predict, prevent, and counter these serious threats. It focuses on intelligence, law enforcement, and judiciary response to terrorism, whereas IGAD Center of Excellence for Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism, which was established in 2006 as a sole and premier center in Africa, focus on soft approach that aimed at denying extremist group fertile ground and followers to recruit and radicalize that led for a spread of terrorism. It is geared towards mobilizing the collective action of state and non-state actors to resist, reject, challenge, and undermine violent extremist ideologies, narratives, and messaging. In summary, IGAD counter-terrorism approach focused on three layers. The first one is root cause approach. It is done by the Center of Excellence, focusing on countering messaging, counter-radicalization, and addressing root causes. The second layer is criminal justice approach, which is done by IGAD Security Sector Program that focus on legislative response, capacity building, counter-terrorism financing, border security control, cross-border cooperation, maritime security, and others. The third layer is focused on economic, political, and governance that focus on development, rights, justice. This is done by member states. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, IGAD championed or underscored the following best practices to deny the conducive factors to the spread of terrorism and violent extremism through strengthening the role of women in countering terrorism and preventing and countering violent extremism, engagement of the youth in countering radicalization, prevention of radicalization in prisons, counter-radicalization, disengagement and reintegration of terrorists in Somalia, disrupting money laundering, the financing of terrorism, strengthening member states' capability to effectively investigate and prosecute terrorists, strengthening border security and control capacities, and above all, IGAD conflict early warnings recently operationalized comprehensive early warning mechanisms that include terrorism and violent extremism, among others, will also enhance the CT-PCVE efforts. To sum up, IGAD initiatives are challenged by weaker cross-border cooperation and coordination, existence of political and economic marginalized groups, capacity limitation of member states, porous and unpoliced borders, and online radicalization, recruitment, and fundraising. Thus, to address these challenges, IGAD has initiatives on governance on human rights to address the root causes, countering improvised explosive devices, working together with Interpol, enhancing evidence and based interventions through continued assessment and mapping of terrorists, threats, actors, and their networks, anti-money laundering measures, and others. Finally, we believe, IGAD believe, we have to collectively engage or fight to defeat terrorism. When I said collectively, the United Nations, Africa Union, and other institutions to defeat terrorism and violent extremism effectively through coordinated efforts and holistic approach by addressing the root causes and effective law enforcement measures that observe the principle of rule of law and human rights standards. I thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Moulinev, for this useful information, the program of work of the security sector program in counter-terrorism and the engagement of IGAD. So now I give the floor to the third panelist, Mrs. Cheryl Frank, Head Transnational Threat International Crime Program, Institute for Security Studies. So you have the floor to deliver your remarks.
Thank you very much, co-chairs, and thank you to the UNOCT and for this opportunity to address this esteemed audience. I would like to address my remarks very literally to this theme of lessons learned. And I particularly want to draw evidence for what I say today from two pieces of research that we've done, examining PVE projects, over 300 projects in the 10 countries most affected by terrorism in Africa, on both sides of the continent, and drawing from our own technical assistance work with countries across the continent. So diving straight in then, the first lesson I want to talk about is how at the operational level we cannot keep ignoring the direct interlinkages between our CT measures that we use and our ability to prevent violent extremism. And so I want to speak mostly about the very extreme CT measures that we use, including often the unprecedented use of force in the context of CT actions, often violent and harsh measures against communities based on accusations of complicity in terrorism, harboring foreign fighters, returning fighters, etc. And then how we do justice is arbitrary arrests, often mass trials, and allow little provision for due process justice protections in the context of these very extreme measures that we're taking. In Africa, we forget our drive towards the broader goals that we're trying to achieve on this continent. And particularly, again, noted by Her Excellency Juma at her remarks at the Secretary General's luncheon, is development is an enormous goal for us, justice, good governance in Africa. And we are undermining these goals and the very objectives we're trying to achieve through these very harsh CT measures that we take. In fact, we are feeding those very factors that evidence tells us are amongst the key drivers of violent extremism. So importantly, the CT measures being taken are perpetuating violence, hate, and anger, and promoting grievances into the future, which mitigates against any successful PVE agenda. So it's a difficult thing to recognize, but these are some of the, this is coming from the evidence of a lot of research across our continent. Lesson 2 that I want to talk about is sometimes our PVE interventions can be misdirected. PVE overwhelmingly argues that our prevention solutions are to be found at the local level and at the community level. So this is something that our community generally accepts. This assumption is allowing for two very risky things to happen. One is that our evidence is telling us that many of the key drivers of violent extremism relate to grievance associated with the structural factors of our countries and our societies and our continent and the world. And these include structural factors such as abuses of human rights, marginalization, inequality, to name just a few. Now, these should be on the agenda of governments to address. Communities cannot address these factors, and these are often key drivers. And of course, governments need to hold each other to account for improvements in these areas. The second risky thing that's happening is that we are placing responsibility for fixing these problems on local communities who are already overburdened by violence, meeting basic needs, etc. And so our evidence shows that, and our evidence shows that it's often women who are trying to deal with these problems at the community level. So I see my time is almost up, and I will...
We'll be generous.
So I would like to raise another lesson, is that we have come to deal with terrorism with very serious blinders at the current moment, is that, you know, we carry internationally a global burden of violence, to use the public health language, that is massive. What we do in our CT work and our PVE work is we take a sliver of that violence and try to deal with it. And our research shows that our communities want to define what their problems are and which aspects of violence they want to deal with themselves. And part of our problem is that we aren't using some of the better methodologies, development methodologies that could be used. And so the ethics of this PVE agenda, which takes a tiny sliver of the violence only, where there is so much that communities are dealing with, is a problem for us. So to conclude, I would like to say that I believe that in terms of PVE, we know far more about what we should not be doing than what we should be doing. And there is still a long timeline of learning that we need to have in this field before we move on. PVE is long-term work. We sometimes need 5 years, 15 years, even a generation to address problems. The second thing I'd like to conclude with is that we need to start building our evidence base. This means that our research needs to invest in documenting, evaluating, and publicizing the results of PVE programs. And we need to learn from our colleagues who have been doing violence prevention for over 30 to 40 years in other fields, so that we can benefit from that learning and bring it into these interventions that we work on. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. It's a cherry, only 50 seconds more, so not bad. Thank you very much for your comment on PVA policies. I think the lessons learned, what had to not be done, but what should be done, I think it's a good reflection of how we should change maybe our methodology and have some more concrete results. So thank you very much for your thoughts and your remarks. So now I move to the fourth panelist, Mrs. Isedua Derek Sprigg, Regional Director for East and Southern Africa, UN Women. So, Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good evening, co-chairs, Your Excellencies in the room, ladies and gentlemen. I think violent extremism and terrorism is spreading. A few years ago, we were talking about emerging security issues. Unfortunately, they are here with us, and they are spreading both in geographical space as well as in numbers of people who are actually engaging in these acts. The effects of them are disastrous, and they affect men differently from women. Coming from UN Women, I would like to focus my talk on the gender perspectives of CVE and terrorism. Many times we look at the role of women in a stereotypical manner, as victims, as survivors, as the soft part of the two gender. Unfortunately, with terrorism, the women are actors as well as being victims, and they participate in all phases of the process. We know that the impact of terrorism on women causes the loss of their livelihoods. There are no schools for the young people. They lose their homes. There's an increase in sexual violence and ultimately death. Therefore, we think that prevention must have an equal part of the response. And looking at prevention, we think, and we are very, very confident about this, that women and youth must play a meaningful part. They must engage meaningfully in all phases of the prevention and response to terrorism. Something that I think we lack, just like the last speaker has said, is a lot of research. Why would women and youth be radicalized? What makes them radicalized? What's the role of spirituality with women? We know that maybe this is also stereotypical, but women are more religious than the men folk. So what is it in the spirituality of women that makes them prone to being radicalized for terrorism? We think the responses, as well as working with governments and national structures, should also include community dialogues, dialogues with the leaders in the community, traditional leaders, religious leaders, the youth themselves, and CSOs. Should include economic empowerment, because sometimes we believe that a lack of economic empowerment or the perceived injustice that youth feel towards governments is something that pushes them into being radicalized. We also think that there must be counter or alternative narratives in the media as to the reasons why people would want to go that route and to counter what it is that they believe is the way out in terms of whatever injustices that they feel. Also, we should also take counter-terrorism strategies as an integral part of all peace and security strategies, including security sector reform and including women in the security arms or sectors that are dealing with terrorism. There's a need for increased awareness, and also it's very important that when we think of rehabilitation and reintegration, for those who have gone out and have been radicalized, coming back into the communities, we must look at a gender perspective, because the community will frown very seriously or more at a woman who has gone out and has been radicalized coming back into the community, because they would wonder why a woman should be in such a violent space. Women are expected to be very peaceful. Finally, I think it's important that we actually monitor the work that we are doing. If you have listened to all the presentations, the strategies are basically the same. The figures state that terrorist attacks in 2018 was less than that in 2017. But we do know that there are several countries now that are beginning to get insurgencies where there were none before. So there is a spread indeed. So we need to evaluate all the strategies that we have been doing over the years to find out if they are working. But I know that it is important also to mainstream gender in all these strategies. And our experience has come from several countries like Nigeria, Mali, Kenya, and other countries in the Sahel. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, Mrs. Derek Brick, for your very enriching presentation. And of course, there will be no peace nor conflict prevention without women's participation in the negotiation. We all know that sustainable peace is only sustainable if women are part of the process. So thank you for your very acute comment and proposal. So that, my dear friends, brings us to the end of this first part of this interesting panel. Let's thank and congratulate all panelists for their intervention. There has been views representing governments, non-governments, stakeholders, and I think I could see that has been some critical, positive, let's say, comments in order that we can review how we are going to address in the future the PVE policy. And I think this change of methodology, accessing what has been doing well and what is not going well, could give us, some, let's say, positive lessons for the future. So thank you very much for having me as chairman of this part of the session, and now I hand it over to my friend, Mr. Ben Nasser, to chair the next round of intervention from the floor. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Thank you. Well, I have before me a long list of speakers, so I'll begin with the speakers that haven't been able to speak this morning. I'll therefore give the floor first to Ambassador Hamdi Leza, Deputy Foreign Minister of the Arab Republic of Egypt for African Affairs. You have the floor.
Much, Mr. Chairman. It is widely recognized that in combating terrorism, we have to take a step back and prevent violent extremism conducive to terrorism. But we are here to exchange lessons learned with the objective to stay ahead of the threat. And there is no way to do this without taking a second step back to tackle the ideology and the incubator leading young people more and more to violent extremism and terrorism. There is a saying that nothing is more dangerous than an idea when we have only one idea. This is certainly true when the idea is to join an exclusive group, believe in its supremacy, and in God's wish for this group to govern the whole world. A tempting idea for youth in a state of revolt, especially when it is supported by generous financing and clan clientele policies. The strategy of these groups is to make sure that they use the weakness of the legal and administrative frameworks and infiltrate schools, NGOs, charity organizations, government institutions under many covers, not to raise suspicion until order is received to move to the next phase. This approach seems peaceful, innocent, but it can become violent to eliminate those who resist and become obstacle to what they believe is God's plan. More and more countries, not only in Africa, are reviewing this incremental process of infiltration and the risks it poses for the stability and the identity of the country. We recall that when leaders of these groups were asked to comment on al-Baghdadi announcement of the creation of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, they did not reject or condemn his announcement. They only criticized the timing of the announcement and the lack of adequate preparation. This is what they are doing, preparing the ground. So let's move another step back and dismantle their network of infiltration of our societies and not keep waiting for the violent extremism and terrorism to present itself officially to us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to Eritrea, Ambassador Bayen Rosum, Ambassador to Kenya and Tanzania. You have the floor.
Dear co-chairs, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Allow me to briefly highlight Eritrea's views and best practices on the prevention and combating of terrorism and extremism. Number one is promotion of social harmony. Eritrea's society, a multi-ethnic and multi-religious, has lived within itself for centuries in peace and harmony. In the past 2 decades, despite the arduous challenges that our region has faced with extreme ideologies, Eritrea has remained a peaceful and harmonious nation. Social peace, a proven asset in combating extremism, has been cultivated by policies of secularism, social justice, and an educational system that aimed to inculcate the culture of civic service and the promotion of human dignity. The second one is active public participation. As a victim of terrorism, since the earliest days of its independence, Eritrea condemns and actively combats terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Without a conscious and vigilant public participation at all levels, terrorism would have sabotaged the survival and development of the nation. The active involvement of religious and societal leaders in the development and implementation of national policies is overly crucial. At the operational level, all relevant local enforcement bodies are working with the highest vigilance to combat any threat of terrorism. Public awareness raising programs, including at schools, are regularly conducted by concerned authorities in coordination with communities. The third one is regional and international cooperation. Eritrea, with the belief that beyond security cooperation, combating terrorism requires cooperation to create a conducive environment for people to live in peace and dignity, has been working to promote durable and regionally owned peace and development. In this regard, dear co-chairs, the comprehensive peace agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia, its anniversary yesterday, July 9, was momentous. Eritrea is engaging with countries in the region to achieve sustainable peace and to promote cooperation at all spheres, thereby ensuring terrorism has no breeding ground. Furthermore, Eritrea is embarking on a comprehensive crime prevention partnership with the NODC in areas of enhancing its legal, institutional, and technological capacities to combat transitional organized crimes. Finally, co-chairs, I would like to stress on 2 points. First, the interlinkage between terrorism and other forms of organized crimes, such as trafficking in person and smuggling of migrants, needs to be emphasized at policy and operational levels. These crimes reinforce each other, and they have to be addressed comprehensively. Second one is creating a narrative of hope as opposed to the narrative of extremism and terrorism is essential. While international development agendas were discussed for decades, hundreds of millions still are languishing in poverty. Hence, we should expedite international cooperation to create a conducive environment for every nation to unleash its full development potentials, including transforming international institutions and processes that deal with peace and security, finance, trade, etc. I thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I will remind you to please respect the time limit, as we don't have a lot of time, so please stick to your allotted time limit. My next speaker is Guinea, Ms. Mama Aisita Wangora.
Legal and Consular Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Ambassador. À vous la parole.
The floor.
Voilà, on va passer donc.
Very well. We'll move on to the next speaker then.
The United Kingdom, Ambassador Nick Haley, High Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United Kingdom, like so many nations represented here today, has been victim of terrorism, both on our own soil and to our citizens overseas. My remarks are focused on the lessons we have learned from these attacks in terms of protecting our security and preparing the terrorist response. By protect, we mean improving security in places that are open and easily accessible, such as hotels, shopping malls. They generally have few direct security measures, but they are often targets. By preparing, we mean knowing how we will respond and practicing our response among all the emergency services. And I have, Mr. Chairman, 3 lessons to share around protecting and preparing. The first is the importance of working with partners outside of government. The private sector can be a powerful force in threat mitigation. People working at hotels or malls or other sites can play a key role in recognizing and reporting suspicious behavior. Protective security can be designed into buildings in ways that do not stand out, but that add significantly to their protection. The second lesson we have to share is the need for emergency responders to coordinate their response. For example, they need to be able to communicate with each other at the scene of an attack using the same systems and the same protocols. When we held an inquiry into the 7/7 bombings on the London Underground, we found, for example, that ambulance and police responders could not speak to each other in the tunnels where they were rescuing people, and we have learnt lessons from that. Emergency responders need to coordinate their plans, exercise and test those plans so they know what to do when terror strikes. And the third lesson we have to share, Mr. Chairman, is around strong strategic governmental direction before, during and after a terrorist crisis. We have developed a mechanism known as COBRA, the Cabinet Office Briefing Room, which brings together ministers, security officials, emergency responders and communications teams to make decisions in real time around an emergency. And we use this mechanism to ensure that all parts of government are coordinated and understand which area is leading which aspect of the response. It means also that the government can communicate with the public one agreed message. We have exported this model internationally and work with countries globally, including here in Kenya, to share experiences and lessons around these issues. So, Mr. Chairman, we're committed to continuing our work around the globe to help our partners protect and prepare themselves for terrorist attacks. We have a dedicated overseas unit to that end, which provides assistance to many partners around the world, and our commitment today is to increase that work further in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. My next speaker is the League of Arab States representative, Your Excellency, Ambassador Abdul Mohammed.
Mr. Co-Chair, Excellencies, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. أرجو أن أتقدم بداية بالتهنئة والتقدير إلى جمهورية كينيا.
Thank you very much. I should like to express my gratitude to the Republic of Kenya and also to the Secretary General of the United Nations for this initiative, as well as for convening this conference at a time when there are myriad threats hanging over the entire world. I also want to express to you the greetings of the Secretary General of the Arab League. As you're well aware, violent extremism knows no borders. In light of this very dangerous state of affairs, which threatens peace and security, we must pool our efforts within the framework of a dedicated strategy and broader cooperation efforts with a view to vanquishing these terrorist groups, as well as in order to be able to put an end to the recruitment of new terrorists. As you know, the Arab States region has suffered a great deal because of the actions of terrorist groups. This has had deleterious repercussions for our economy and also in social terms. This situation, as I've just pointed out, has had nefarious consequences for the Arab world. And it is for that very reason that within the framework of international cooperation, we are committed to bolstering our institutions, working hand in hand with international institutions focused on combating terrorism. We will be prioritizing a number of key areas, including promoting youth education, awareness raising, as well as the necessity to endow ourselves with the necessary means so that we can strengthen mass media and broaden youth participation in social affairs, in political life. These are all efforts we're undertaking with a view to protecting and upholding human rights. Moreover, we are committed to working hand in hand with civil society organizations. Last but not least, international cooperation as well as regional cooperation are absolutely vital if we are to counter terrorism. It is incumbent upon us to ensure that sufficient financial resources are allocated to training, to information sharing and intelligence sharing. By way of conclusion, I should like to say that we cannot stamp out terrorism unless we cooperate at the international level. It's important to be mindful of the fact that terrorism knows no borders and has no nationality.
Monsieur Alexandre.
Thank you. Mr. Alexander Carr, Executive Director, Partnership and Planning, will be my next speaker. You have the floor, sir.
Donc on passe au suivant.
Well, moving on down the list then. Africa Center for Strategic Studies from DC, Dr. Anwar Bukaz.
Thank you, Excellency. Violent extremism continues to be one of the most significant challenges to peace and security in Africa, as we heard today. And what makes this state of affairs particularly frustrating is that despite the extraordinary sacrifice and the enormous amount of blood and treasure that Africans and their international partners have spent, violent extremist groups have still been able to flourish and expand their reach into different zones and regions. So even in theaters where they were described as vanquished or in their final throes, violent extremist organizations have grown stronger and deadlier. So the resilience and proliferation of these organizations is puzzling because their objectives and their methods are far more radical than the people they claim to represent. Surveys and available data, show that the vast majority of Africans, they oppose violent extremism and terrorism, yet Al-Qaeda-aligned groups, the Islamic State affiliates, and other violent extremist groups, they continue to attract recruits. They continue to attract financing, shrewdly exploiting opportunities created by state fragility, by exclusionary governance and local conflicts. So from the Sahel region and the Lake Chad Basin to East Africa, as we have heard today, violent extremist groups, they have infiltrated existing local conflicts and they have aligned themselves with local causes. So in areas where they have managed to control territory, groups such as the Islamic State in West Africa province, for example, they have focused on delivering basic forms of governance and social services to the rural populations. In other theaters where they could not completely supplant the state, these organizations, they exploit and they stoke political instability, intercommunal tensions, and socioeconomic grievances. So as violent extremist groups, they establish new footholds and they seek to expand elsewhere in Africa. It's critical that we assess how these groups operate, how do they recruit, and how they master resources. The dispensing of brutal, justice and of building governance operations are, for example, becoming a critical part of the toolkit of these violent extremist organizations. That's why it's vital for us to understand how and when these strategies are used, as they help provide insight into how these organizations are governed, how they provide social services, and how they cultivate popular support. So the growth and expansion of violent extremist organizations in the Sahel, in the Lake Chad Basin, and in East Africa illustrate that their resilience, that their potency stems from more than their military prowess. Thank you very much.
Merci, merci.
Thank you, Doctor. My next speaker is here in front of me. From Nigeria, Manjapita Nazor. He's coordinator. You have the floor, sir.
Co-chairs, distinguished excellencies here, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Maji Peters. I'm from Care Fronting, a non-governmental organization in Nigeria that works predominantly in the Northeast. So whatever I'm going to say, the experiences I'm going to share is going to be from my work with Boko Haram, and thanking the Global Center recently for making it possible for us to do some interventions in Kenya as well. And my contribution is coming from the first session on terrorism experiences in Africa, good practices, and lessons learned. And the first thing I want to look at is, why does terrorism exist in Africa, and what are the things that makes it fatal? The issue of poverty, groupthink. A lot of people that join extremist groups, some of them just get lured by the concept of groupthink and the influence of the context where they are, and not forgetting the very strong presence of the push and pull factors that can be seen in all of the contexts within the countries of Africa. And what should be done to mitigate the threats of terrorism in Africa? We have to develop programs that promote community cohesion so that we go back to the context of using values and what has kept us ingrained and rooted in times past. And importantly, work closely with security agencies, structures of the state to support reintegration and community resilience. The issue of stigma, reprisal, anger, wanting to get back, vengeance has all contributed in keeping it going. So we need to look at how we can work with structures of the state to support reintegration and build resilience in communities that have experienced mass atrocities. And we should create platforms for shared learning and counter-narratives, where best practices from other spheres could be learned and contextualized to see how it can work. And most importantly, we must be able to create a platform for radicalization tracking. A lot of the systems that we do, and even in countries that have signed CVE policies, they don't have a platform for radicalization tracking, and most of the times that happen, it was because of radicalization that a lot of people get into it. Then counter-radicalization and the radicalization messaging, it should be structured in such a way that the system encourages strategic communication so that the radicalization and counter-radicalization messaging will be ingrained within the context. And most importantly, we must be able to use the strength and the power of the media. Sometimes last year I was in Kenya when they had the attack in Nairobi. I must say the NCTC did a very great job in ensuring that they didn't lie about the attack, but they did not spend their time talking about the impact that the attack has had, because that again influences the fear factor, and that's what the terrorist groups want to do. But what the NCTC did in December is actually very appreciative. They concentrated on showing the efficiency of what they are doing, the effectiveness of their response, and the position of the government of the people of Kenya, which is very good. And in sharing best practices, it would be very advisable for every nation in Africa to develop a CVE policy. Interestingly, Nigeria has developed and signed a national CVE policy. We're hoping that we're going to have state and regional policies too that will move us forward. And then we must be able to reignite community values to promote trust and relationship building. Looking at the researches we've done in why people get radicalized and why people join VEGs, you see that there's a lot of disconnect between what used to be our values in our communities and promoting trust and relationship that has been inherent in cultures in Africa. As an organization, we have worked in the Northeast and we're training first responders in communities to support traumatized persons, to mitigate vengeance and reprisals. And most of the times, a lot of people in community talk about reprisals. So we wanted to work on that, especially when the government was looking at the concept of amnesty. So it would be good for us to be able to set up training that will enable people that have experienced mass atrocities to get through the challenges that they've experienced. And in partnership with the Global Center and the Embassy of the United States in Abuja, we're building trust and relationship in communities through training on forgiveness and reconciliation and opening listening clinics where people that are traumagenic can come and get engaged with people that will help them with therapies and counseling. And that has created a platform for a lot of disclosures that has helped in working with those who are still within the framework of violent extremist groups that want to get out. And we're now looking at the very important step of reintegrating restorative justice to works of the community. Because a lot of times when people get out from the spheres of violent extremist groups, a lot of other people feel like, yes, we are the ones that have been harmed, we're the ones that have been hurt. We can't just let go and let it fly like that. So I think if people are responsible for acts of harm they have committed, especially using the platform of restorative justice, we'll be able to have a more acceptable and a more fruitful countering and preventing and transforming violent extremism programs. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Donc, la parole.
My next speaker will be from Interpol, Mr. Alexander Karl, Executive Director, Partnerships and Planning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome this opportunity to talk a little bit about the work of Interpol, and particularly in connection with session 1 to discuss lessons learned. As the largest intergovernmental criminal police organization in the world, Interpol serves 194 member countries. We prioritize our work and our activities around 3 key areas. Of course, the major one is what we're talking about today and tomorrow, which is counterterrorism. But we also focus on organized and emerging crimes and cybercrime. We support our member countries by providing a global secured communication system that we call I-24/7 that allows law enforcement to be in touch with one another at any time, anywhere they may be located, so they can pursue criminals who are doing harm to our communities. Interpol also hosts 18 police databases accessible to our country, to our member countries, that provides real information in real time, and we provide intelligence analysis, investigative support, cross-border operations, and capacity building to our member countries. Our databases are searched at a rate of 200 searches per second 365 days a year. Yes, you heard correctly. 200 searches per second, 365 days a year. So these capabilities are not something that we manage exclusively from our headquarters in Lyon. We also have 7 regional bureaus around the globe, including 4 right here in Africa. 1 in Nairobi, 1 in Harare, in Yaoundé, and Abidjan. 4 out of 7 reflects the priority we assess to the continent here. So let me talk for a few minutes about lessons learned in the pursuit of terrorists and terrorism activities. Of course, we all are focused on preventing attacks in our communities. That's what we have to do. But when one does occur, the national authorities must move extraordinarily fast. Example, in less than 24 hours following the January 2019 terrorist attack here in Nairobi, at the request of the Kenyan government, who had the foresight to ask, Interpol deployed an incident response team, an IRT, made up of experts in intelligence analysis, digital forensic, weapons and explosives, and investigators to assist with on-site investigations. The regional bureau here in Nairobi was quite involved in facilitating this deployment. The outcome, because the government moved fast and solicited the assistance of Interpol, the collection of the evidence and the analysis of the evidence gathered from the mobile communication enabled investigators to identify financial connections, behavioral patterns and timeline, and routes of travel of some of the participants, resulting in the identification of additional suspects and their arrest in other parts of the world. Lessons learned number 2. The UN Security Council on a number of occasions have called on member countries to take particular action. And I will only cite just a few here. UN Security Council Resolution 2118, dated year 2014. UN Security Council Resolution 2322 in 2016, and 2396 in 2017. All of these Security Council resolutions have called in one form or another for member countries to really augment and add more to the, and populate the databases that Interpol has, and to use the Interpol databases and in other words, to populate and have the information that you do possess, that countries possess, and share that information with other member countries. It is important to do so because it is for all of our safety. Only a few months ago, by way of an example, we carried a 10-day operation to target the movement of foreign terrorist fighters and criminals across 3 countries. And these countries were Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. The success of this operation led to the arrest of a very serious criminal who happened to be on a list of wanted fugitives from South Africa. Now, South Africa was not even involved in this 10-day operation that we conducted. This goes to show you having the information and sharing it really enables countries to protect themselves. Now all three countries are busy, who are involved in this operation, are busy populating the nominal database of Interpol as well as the stolen and lost travel documents that terrorists use to cross borders, so that it will make it easier for countries to detect folks who are coming into their territories. Beyond our member countries and our relationships with ministries of interior, police and security agencies, and sometimes ministries of foreign affairs, we also maintain relationships with a number of regional police organizations and international organizations like ECOWAS, the G5 Sahel, and UNOCT, one of the hosts of this conference here. Why is that important? It's important because we have to collect that information that is available out there among our member countries and share that information, and I've said that already. But the battlefield is rich with information to help identify terrorists, and we need to collectively work on trying to get that information and share it. Similarly, a number of individuals have been convicted on terrorist-related offenses. These terrorists, some of them did not receive lengthy sentences, and they will someday get out of jail. And consistent with national laws, it is important that biometrics information be collected about these individuals. So I take this opportunity to highlight some of the work that Interpol is doing to protect and make the world a safer place. And I encourage all of the member countries present here today to use Interpol's databases and capabilities to protect your citizens. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. We'll now move on to the second list of speakers of the second panel. There are 14 speakers on the list: Benin, Guinea, Ethiopia, League of Arab States, Francophonie, Bangladesh, Canada, China, Philippines, Interpol, UNDP, Haki Africa, Human Security Collective, Uganda, Muslim Youth Development. So I will give the floor to each of these speakers, one after the other, while reminding you that you have 3 minutes speaking time. And this is required because we have a lot of speakers and we want everyone to be able to take the floor. So Benin, Mr. Marcel Baglot, Director General of Integrated Border Area Management Agency. You have the floor. Thank you, Co-Chair. My country, Benin, believes that extremism is a process, because we need to understand this process in order to respond to it. Within this context, then, we have understood that violent extremism is based on a feeling of abandonment by people, and this is due to frustration, and which then leads to radicalization, and then which then leads to terrorism. So Benin has chosen to intervene very early on through prevention in order to resolve this issue. Secondly, studies carried out in the country show that radicalization often takes place in border areas. And we have seen in other African countries as well that in Africa, often terrorism is fomented in border areas. So border areas tend to be the hotbeds for terrorism. So we propose a national strategy for the development of these border areas. This process involves 4 main components. First, strengthening the defense of the national territory with a focus on border areas. In 5 years, Benin has built 60 police stations to bring security closer to the population in these border areas and showing the usefulness of the state to these people. It's created a special forces, a special police unit focusing on these border areas, as well as local community police. And this police is under the elite army unit as well, which also provides them with support. Benin has gone even further, though, by carrying out reform in the security sector, by merging the national police and the national military police under the Republican police. Benin has also launched, along with neighboring countries, a strengthening of its borders. Sometimes you can forget about certain border areas. On this point, Benin has decided to reduce poverty and increase equality amongst populations in these areas. Around 150 schools have been built in order to help children have access to education. We've also built medical centers, host centers for women, and we've also helped these women living in these areas. Finally, we've had efforts to bring these areas more into contact with the rest of the country. We've had around 200 drilling operations to have enabled these people to have access to water. We also have increased cross-border cooperation with development of comprehensive integrated projects between countries in border areas. And working to improve security in these areas. Along with Togo, we have set up a project. And we also have the DACRA process, which is very important, and which is a security cooperation project between the intelligence, security, and defense chiefs of the various participating countries, Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, Togo, Burkina Faso, Niger, etc. Emphasis particularly placed on training personnel, exchange of information in terms of trans-border criminality, organized transnational crime, and joint security operations. And this is based on cooperation between the countries. Benin has also improved its institutional frameworks for borders. We now have an integrated agency for border management, an agency to fight against radicalization and terrorism and violent extremism has also been set up. And as I've said, we have participated in merging the national police and the national military police to have the current Republican police to monitor the financing and these structures. We set up a national center for the processing of financial transactions, which works with banks in order to monitor transfer of resources going towards these people. So just a few words, that's what we're doing in our country. And we have brought documentation here with us, which I will provide to anyone who would like to read it. Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Kenya. Mrs. Isata Bangoro, Director General of Legal and Consular Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
On passe au suivant.
Move on to the next speaker on the list.
Okay. League of Arab
States, Excellency Ambassador Mohamed Mabrouk Ali, Head of Mission of the League of Arab States in Nairobi. You have the floor.
I think I had my chance on the first session. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I'll give the floor to the Francophonie, Ambassador Abdul Rahman of Bangladesh. No? Abdul Rahman, you have the floor.
President.
Thank you, Chair. And speakers who have spoken before me this morning and this afternoon, I would also like to thank the United Nations and the government of Kenya for organising this conference. On behalf of His Excellency Ms. Shikiwabu, the Secretary General of the OIF, I would like to express our thanks to you for organising this meeting. The Francophone countries are also affected by the issues of terrorism and extremism. Therefore, we've carried out activities in this area as well, mainly focusing on capacity building for judges and police. Of course, we also recognize that the issue of terrorism is a very sensitive issue. First and foremost, it concerns the responsibility of states through their police, intelligence, and army services. I think that's very important to keep in mind. Given the effects of this issue, though, we support these state efforts. On this point, then, I'd just like to conclude with 2 points. Firstly, we have begun an initiative a few days ago in Burkina Faso, bringing together strategic research centers to combat terrorism. And we'll also have a meeting next year in Tunis on the issue of the prevention of terrorism. The second point regards peak data, or big data, sorry, and Director of Interpol talked about this. We also need to support states within the context of digitizing and identifying, because to have big data, we need to have people's identities. We can give an example of the countries of Sahel region. There are millions of people there without identity cards, though, without legal identities. So, in terms of international cooperation, we need to intervene so that we can support states in this. This is also a way to strengthen infrastructure to fight against terrorism. We therefore need to support state efforts so that all citizens within these countries are well identified, and this will facilitate the work that we carry out. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you. I now give the floor to Ambassador Salim Ahmed, Director General of International Cooperation and Global Issues. You have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, allow me to extend my thanks and appreciation on behalf of my delegation to our sisterly country, Kenya, for the gracious hospitality. And it goes without saying that we extend our thanks to Kenya, to the United Nations, and the AU for organizing this vital conference, a very timely one as well. The Sudan is a very tolerant and moderate society, multi-racial and multi-ethnical. It is immune by virtue of its nature from terrorism. However, the Sudan has been aware by virtue of the increase of terrorism worldwide of the importance of adopting a national strategy that adopts the principles followed worldwide in fighting terrorism. Thus, the civil society composed of women, youth, local leaders, as well as the state institutions and the private sector, they have cooperated with the international organizations to learn from the best practices and the lessons learned that could be summarized as follows. It has adopted direct intellectual dialogue with the extremists who have been detained and arrested as an effective way that has had extremely positive results that came as a surprise by international practitioners even. It's an experience worthy of being shown to the whole world because, as was said, this is a global effort that cannot be carried out by one country or one institution only, as was said during several interventions and presentations this morning. One of the means that the strategy contains is the establishment of specialized centers through qualified, moderate experts that know how to run such dialogues professionally. Also, centers for reintegration and rehabilitation have been established in order to follow up on the reintegration programs. There are also intensive awareness-raising programs for prevention through religious leaders, preachers, women, youth leaders, all in their respective domain. They have been among the extremely important methods that have immunized our society from the infiltration of terrorism in the Sudanese society, notwithstanding the challenges it is facing, be it political, economic, or social ones. Moreover, we have developed programs to train the trainers, those moderate trainers, with coordination and partnership of the sisterly state of Morocco through Rabita al-Muhammadiyya, which is a local association. And we have trained a good number of trainers, and the results have been really rewarding. And it is indeed an experience we take pride in, and we are proud to put forward to those interested because it might be of use to societies similar to the Sudan. The prison community has also been targeted with concerted efforts, community-based efforts, and training for those who have been released after the completion of their sentence, for them not to be affected negatively by the speech that they could confront by several mass media through the internet and others. They could easily infiltrate the brains of our sons and daughters. Hence, we have to protect them with means that would provide them with the necessary immunity, because the security methods are not enough. Under the reintegration within Africa, by virtue of our geographic location and having several neighboring countries, we have cooperated with our sisterly states, Chad, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Egypt, in a number of transnational crimes and the criminals who have infiltrated into our country. And we take our sisterly state of Libya as an example, and we hope that it is steered to safety eventually. Another success story that we could put forward to the world, and some interventions have referred to such successful experiences. Another matter that I would like to refer to in this important conference, I would like to reassure you that the Sudan that has had a youth revolution, a young Sudanese lady has spoken this morning about the role of the Sudanese and the Sudanese youth in particular. We would like to confirm what she said, that we are a very tolerant society, and you will all celebrate with us a new dawn in our country, in our continent. Today will surely be better. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. I now give Liza Stadbo, High Commissioner, Ambassador and Permanent Representative to UN Habitat and UNAR. You have the floor.
Donc on passe au second.
Move to the next speaker, China. Chargé d'affaires, Mr. Zhao Jialo. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. China commends Kenya and the UN OCT for convening this conference, and thanks the government of Kenya and the UN for the preparation of the conference. Since its establishment, under the able leadership of Under-Secretary General Mr. Voronkov, UNOCT has actively assisted member states with their counterterrorism capacity development and promoted international cooperation. China highly commends this and will continuously support the work of the UNOCT. Terrorism is the public enemy of all mankind and is a transnational threat which cannot be defeated by a single country. At present, the fight against terrorism still faces serious challenges, and counterterrorism actions in Africa is part and parcel of the global counterterrorism efforts. In recent years, African countries have been actively combating terrorism in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa. Remarkable results have been achieved, but African countries still face many challenges, so the international community should continuously provide support to African countries. The following should be done. First, apply the same standards and strengthen counterterrorism synergy. No matter where the terrorists are, when they carry out their acts, whatever banner they wave or whichever country they target, they must be cracked down. China supports that the UN plays a central coordinating role in the international counterterrorism cooperation. China hopes that the UNOCT prioritizes the capacity building of African countries and provides strong support to African countries. Second, address both the symptoms and causes and eradicate the root causes of terrorism and extremism. The international community should abide by the UN Charter and respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of African countries. It should not interfere with African countries' views, with their internal affairs. And China hopes that the international community will assist African countries to implement 2030 agenda and expand investments in these countries and help African countries to end poverty, achieve economic development, and improve people's livelihood. Special attention should be paid to the youth because they are susceptible to the lure of extremism. Third, support African countries to have ownership of counterterrorism efforts. African countries have a profound knowledge of local problems and have unique advantages in solving these problems. China commends African countries for being united in addressing terrorist threats. China hopes that the UN will enhance its coordination and cooperation with regional and sub-regional organizations in Africa, so that African problems can be solved with African solutions. China has been fully involved in counterterrorism cooperation within the framework of the UN and the Global Counterterrorism Forum, and it has provided important contribution to the international fight against terrorism. China supports a fight in African countries with financial resources, and through bilateral channels, China has also provided material and capacity development to quite a few countries in Africa. And China has already accumulated experience and practices in combating extremism and is willing to share its experience with other countries. China is ready to work with the international community to support and assist African countries to address the terrorist threats and play a constructive role for peace, stability, and development of Africa. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Philippines. Mrs. Arinia Corocoto, Assistant Deputy General, Special Governor's Office, Security Council.
Your Excellencies, Mr. Chair, good afternoon. My remarks highlights the importance of national leadership and multilateral efforts in counter-terrorism and preventing violent extremism. Terrorist activities in the Philippines are being led by the Abu Sayyaf group, the ISIS-Daesh-inspired Dawla Islamiyah, and the Bangsa Moro Islamic Freedom Fighters. Their threat is further exacerbated by the presence of foreign terrorist fighters. Porous borders in southern Mindanao via Sabah East Coast remains to be a continuing vulnerability of the Philippines. Current immigration policy is being exploited for easier entry. The Philippines remains as an ideal target and transit point of foreign violent extremists, as highlighted by the arrest of several suspected foreign terrorist fighters under involvement in the recent bombing in Holo Cathedral and also in military camp in the island of Sulu. In this regard, the Philippines has pursued the following actions to strengthen maritime border security in partnership with neighboring countries. Manila Declaration to counter the rise of radicalization and violent extremism, adopted by the ASEAN ministers on September 2017 during the 11th ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Transnational Crime, chaired and hosted by the Philippines. Sub-regional meetings on counter-terrorism. The Philippines continuously take part in the sub-regional meeting on foreign terrorist fighters and cross-border terrorism led by Australia and Indonesian governments. We also have the Trilateral Cooperative Arrangement. This is a multilateral arrangement between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, which aims to address shared security issues in the maritime areas of common concerns like piracy, kidnap for ransom, terrorism, and other transnational crimes. This arrangement created the Trilateral Maritime Patrol. The Philippines is also heavily involved in the Aqaba dialogue process, and we hope to host the Aqaba process in Southeast Asia in the near future. My office, the National Security Council, in close partnership with the United Nations system, has come up with a national action plan on preventing and countering violent extremism, which was adopted by the National Anti-Terrorism Council of the Philippines last May 27. The Philippine NAP-PCBA is held as first in Southeast Asia, and it would not have been achieved without the all-out support of the UN system, particularly by UNDP and UNOCT. The NAP-PCBA Philippines is a multidisciplinary framework using the whole-of-nation approach in carrying out strategies on preventing and countering violent extremism. It gives particular focus on 6 different sectors identified to be vulnerable to violent extremism, namely community, violent extremist offenders in jails and prisons, religious leaders, learning institutions, social media users and overseas Filipino workers, and students sent abroad for religious studies. In addition, it was found out that the Philippine laws relating to terrorism are also incompatible with anti-terrorism laws of neighboring countries. And there is a need in order to be responsive to its transnational and transborder nature. We have set of legislations pending in Congress. Aside of strengthening the Philippine laws relating to terrorism and adoption of the PCBE, we seek for enduring solution on the problem of terrorism. Our President signed into law the creation of Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao last year. This law abolishes the present autonomous region and creates the new Bangsamoro region. The new autonomous region would address two national security interests. First, it would be the key to the full implementation of GRP-MILF Comprehensive Peace Agreement that in turn would allow the peaceful transition of Moro Islamic Liberation Front from armed groups to legitimate political actors, an establishment of a more representative autonomous government, and the continuation of development initiatives that address the widespread poverty in Muslim Mindanao. The new Bangsamoro Organic Law would minimize the threat of violent extremism in the Philippines. The delayed passage of the autonomous law was used before as propaganda to promote violent extremism. If Congress had failed to pass this last year, it could have been a powerful source for the loss of faith on the peace process. Now that we have this law, this will help curb the spread of extremism in Mindanao, as the new Bangsamoro government would be able to assess moderate Islamic leaders, counter the ideology of radicalism. In summary, the anti-terrorism and PCB approach of the Philippines adopt a peace-building framework because we recognize and seek to rectify the structural root causes of violent extremism, such as the historical injustice suffered by the Bangsamoro people or the Muslims in the Philippines. And we both employ kinetic and non-kinetic methods in responding to this national and global problem. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. My next speaker is His Excellency Mele Salam, Ambassador of Ethiopia to Kenya, Malawi, the Seychelles, and the Comoros.
Thank you, co-chairs. Co-chairs, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed, I would like to thank the people in government of Kenya and UN OCT for convening this timely meeting on prevention of terrorism and extreme violence. Ethiopia has encountered a significant challenge from terrorist groups and networks operating within the IGAD region and beyond. Terrorists manipulate porous borders, existing conflicts in the region, and marginalized groups in the society in their attempt to boost the presence and operational capacity. These tactics make it difficult to end war on terror in the battlefield. Co-chairs, though Ethiopia's security apparatus, with the support of its entire citizenry, managed to keep the country safe from terrorist attacks, terrorism presents a clear and imminent danger to my country. On April 2019, our security establishments thwarted a major terrorist plot by Al-Shabaab. Ethiopia has been working tirelessly with neighboring countries on intergovernmental authority, IGAD, the African Union, the United Nations, and other partners in combating terrorism and violent extremism in all its forms. Co-chairs, Ethiopia identified the protection of human rights, promotion of the rule of law, and good governance as the most effective approach in preventing and countering terrorism. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Dr. Abiy Ahmed, Ethiopia embarked on reforming the political, security, and judiciary sectors. The reform in Ethiopia widens the political space, allowing the release of political prisoners and dissident groups, the removal of a number of organizations from Ethiopian Parliament terrorist list. The reform that secures political participation also allows the political prisoners and the political organizations to play a crucial role in rebuilding Ethiopia in general and preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian method is political. The Ethiopian framework is participatory. Also, the Ethiopian initiative is reform. No people are political prisoners. No organizations are labeled as terrorist groups, and the state is more transparent and responsive than ever before. At regional level, co-chairs, the peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea has far-reaching impact in blowing peace of hope in the Horn of Africa. Our leaders, His Excellency President Isaias Afwerki and Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, took a bold measures to bring the two people closer. As far as Sudan is concerned, Ethiopia and the African Union spearheaded the peace initiative, which ended up in a deal cut between parties. Ethiopia calls the international community to support the Sudan's peace initiative. To conclude, I fully concur with what His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, President of the Republic of Kenya, said this morning. Terrorism is a Pan-African threat, so that calls for a Pan-African response. I thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. My next speaker is His Excellency Andrew Seldorf, Nigerian High Commissioner in Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a point of correction. I'm standing in for the High Commissioner. Thank you. Mr. Chair, at the outset, allow me to also, on behalf of this delegation, express our appreciation to the government of Kenya and the United Nations for hosting this conference. Let me start by saying that a lot has been said here today with very lofty ideas. However, just like Richard Quest, a CNN presenter, in referring to the modern-day slavery, noted, it is not just good words and lofty ideas that will rid the world of slavery. In the same way, in countering terrorism and violent extremism, more action is needed to prevent terrorist attacks and also to prevent and stop radicalization. Especially considering that the terrorist groups have a tendency to spread as well as the ability to maneuver, as was remarked by President Kenyatta this morning in his opening statement. As a result, we urge that national governments must, and that must we have decided to put it in capital, must be willing to collaborate. This is further necessitated by terrorist travels, sometimes evading border securities, as also noted by the US counter-terrorism expert this morning in its presentation. He went further to say that terrorist threats are evolving. As such, we need to up our strategies to counter the threats. Therefore, as noted by Chinua Achebe, a Nigerian poet, in his book, The Things Fall Apart, the little bird said, "Since men have learned to shoot without missing, him too has learned to fly without perching." Consequently, this delegation will urge that we should be one step ahead by collaborating, by effectively sharing information, as was emphasized by the Interpol representative, so as for us to be able to defeat the terrorists. As for Nigeria, some of the steps that have been taken to be one step ahead includes, amongst others, active participation in the Multinational Joint Task Force, MNJTF, spearheading the activities of the Regional Intelligence Fusion Unit, RIFU, headquartered in Abuja. The Nigerian National Assembly also in 2013 strengthened the anti-terror laws. In addition, Nigeria consistently participates in the global coalition to defeat ISIS and other terror groups. The Nigerian government has also, in 2014, adopted the National Counter-Terrorism Strategy. In the same vein, the government in 2017 launched the National Action Plan for Preventing Violent Extremism. And finally, the Nigerian government in 2016 joined the Saudi Arabia Islamic Military Alliance, a counter-terrorism coalition comprising 39 Muslim countries. Mr. Chair, another Nigerian poet, Olarotimi, in the book, The Gods Are Not to Blame, said that when the farm owner is slow to catch the thief will call the farm owner thief. We are therefore urging that if we don't act fast, terrorists will defeat us before we will come to defeat them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. My next speaker is from Niger, the Police Commissioner, Adama Massagamou, the National Security Coordinator of the National Platform of Coordinating Security Affairs Agencies G5 Sahel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to add my voice to those of previous speakers and thanked the Republic of Kenya for their hospitality. I also wish to greet all delegations. Indeed, when it comes to the experience we've accumulated and the best practices we've accumulated in Niger, I'd like to make 3 points. First of all, at the regional level, it must be said that within the framework of the regional strategy for stabilization, recovery, and resilience in the Chad Basin, we planned and took into account the need to empower and to include women and young people. That is, as part of the strategy. Once again, at the regional level, the G5 Sahel set up a joint force to ensure that investigations can be expedited, and for that, we focused on the involvement of police. We have specialized investigative units. They're part of the units tasked with combating terrorism, but also we have other staff who are there with those responding on the ground, because the special investigative units need to be prepared to intervene. And the overall approach is to bring our interventions closer to the ground. Once again, within the framework of the G5 Sahel, it's important to share our experience, including on the platform of cooperation for security. We should share information. This security information platform operates at 2 levels, at the regional and the national level. At the regional level, based in Nouakchott, there's a lot of data collection, data coming from different G5 Sahel countries and being disseminated amongst the other member states meaning that all countries, members of the G5S, have the same information. It's a level playing field in terms of access to information about risks. Furthermore, within the G5 Sahel, we have a Center for Analysis of Threats and Early Warning. Now, this is a center which is not quite up and running yet. But nonetheless, I think this is an example of best practice, so I wanted to share some information about that. That's all on the regional front. Turning now to the national front. We adapted our legislative framework, a process we began in 2016 when a whole host of laws was adopted, taking into account a number of UN resolutions, especially resolutions pertaining to the inclusion of women, combating terrorism and violent extremism. That's at the legislative level. At the operational level, what we've done is, well, you see, once we set up the Central Service for Combating Terrorism in Niger, what we found was that our troops, once they take suspects into custody, they often didn't bring in evidence which can then be submitted and admitted in the courts. In other words, the people that they capture, when they hand over the information to the investigation authorities, they need to also hand over evidence. Within the framework of our regional stabilization strategy for the Lake Chad Basin, what we've done is established a cooperation framework encompassing civilians and representatives of the military. So women, young people, representatives of civil society can meet with representatives of the military, discuss and share information with a view to stepping up the fight against terrorism. Turning now to the intelligence agencies. It cannot be denied, in fact, this has been borne out by experience, we cannot effectively combat terrorism unless we have the right intelligence. And it's for that reason, in Niger, we're currently pondering how we can deem certain intelligence information to be usable within the framework of a court case. Where do we draw the line? Administrative intelligence and intelligence that can lead to prosecution. Next, we have a unit that works on preventing radicalization. That's part of the G5S. This unit has already established a legislative framework. This legislation is now being adopted. This lays the legislative groundwork for worship practices. But what this unit also does is oversee a reception facilities for Boko Haram members who have laid down arms and expressed contrition. What we also have is a national security cooperation platform. This mechanism allows for various security agencies to work hand in hand and exchange information. This security cooperation platform can access the Interpol database, and in fact there's encrypted messaging that's in place so that information can be exchanged with similar security cooperation platforms. This is encrypted communications, this channel. Next, while our legislation doesn't reflect the concerns around foreign terrorist fighters, at the operational level, at the institutional level, we have taken this into account. For instance, when it comes to border security, we've cooperated with our US colleagues, with our EU partners, and also with Interpol. Thanks to Interpol, we've managed to identify a number of terrorists. We've gone to a number of our prisons. We've gathered biometric data from detainees, and thanks to this, we managed to find an individual who, in fact, was a wanted person in Mali, all thanks to information exchange. Lastly, we have a tripartite agreement with Mali and Chad on foreign terrorist fighters. Burkina Faso is now joining this initiative, and we've also invited Mauritania. This is a mechanism for which the police cooperates with the involvement of prosecutors and judges as well. By way of conclusion, I'd like to say that in order for all of these various mechanisms to bear fruit, we do require support, including logistical support. The ambassador of the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie spoke about the importance of gathering information and processing that information, as well as capacity building. You see, the various actors involved, whether they be on the security side, on the side of the courts, have to coordinate their work with each other, as well as with the radicalization prevention units. Therefore, I wish to underscore the importance to pool the anthropological, socioeconomic perspectives and perspectives to bring these perpetrators to justice. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bangladesh will be my next speaker, Mr. Lurupan Landev. Councillor, you have the floor, sir.
Okay. Sorry, the microphone was not working. Let me begin once again. Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. Bangladesh thanks the Government of Kenya and UNOCT for organizing this conference. We would like to broadly share Bangladesh's lessons learned on CT and CVE working at national, regional, and global levels. First, for success against terrorism and violent extremism, political commitment is the key. In Bangladesh, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has declared a zero-tolerance approach to terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. We are also firmly committed not to allow our territory to be used by terrorists against our neighboring countries. This has helped immensely our relations with neighbors. Second, we must remain aware of the need to uphold relevant human rights standards in combating terrorism and having a victim-focused approach in our CT and CV activities. Of course, this requires capacity building and active collaboration among law enforcement and civilian authorities. Human rights and victim-centered approach to CT also go quite well with the idea of defeating terrorists ideologically. We must always be able to stand on moral high ground in our fight against CT and CVE. Third, we must address the root causes and drivers of terrorism. Here comes the question of synergies between development and security actors. As such, we need to actively encourage a whole of government and a whole of society approach to build defense against terrorist and violent extremist elements at the community level. In Bangladesh, our women empowerment and youth development programs have had a far-reaching impact on preventing the spread of violent extremism. Fourth, we need to improve upon strategic communication with a view to counter-terrorist messaging in a synergistic manner. There are plenty of examples that not only the poor and the marginalized segment of the youth get influenced by terrorist ideologies, but also the rich and privileged segment of the societies fall victim of the terrorist ideas. We therefore need to more proactively engage ourselves in social media platforms to reach out to vulnerable minds. Fifth and final, we also need to remain alert about the fourth industrial revolutions and other avenues of technological advancements and their potential impacts on terrorism and violent extremism. In addition, we would like to emphasize on the point of possibility of terrorists gaining the capacity of WMDs biological and chemical weapons. We need meaningful global cooperation to tackle these upcoming challenges in these fronts. I thank you all.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Canada is my next speaker, Lisa Fetbo, High Commissioner in the Republic of Kenya, Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations and the UNDP.
Chair, a point of clarification, I'm Ambassador Michelle Cameron, filling in for the High Commissioner. Co-chairs, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Canada very much welcomes and supports the international efforts to prevent and counter violent extremism. Canada is a staunch advocate of the whole-of-society approach that we've heard so much about over the course of the day, and particularly as it's embodied in the UN's Plan of Action on Preventing Violent Extremism. Based on our own domestic experience and our experience abroad, we are convinced, as you are, that the local-led approach that engages civil society and communities is the most effective way to prevent terrorism and violent extremism. At home and in international contexts, Canada employs and encourages an evidence-based, tailored approach that's informed by the local context and that builds on local strengths and capabilities to foster inclusiveness and resilience. We're definitely encouraged to see the cross-cutting inclusion of women and gender considerations in our discussions today, and looking forward at the rest of the agenda. And over the course of the next day, we look forward to continue learning from the diverse experiences of all panelists, including the female panelist. Canada knows that gender considerations and full integration of the women, peace and security agenda into our efforts to prevent and counter violent extremism is critical for success. Canada also commends the participation of civil society in today's event, or in this event, and we continue to advocate to open up the 2020 high-level conference to civil society participation and non-governmental organizations. Consistent with the interventions of various panelists today, Canada too believes that the only way to reduce and hopefully eradicate violent extremism is through a multifaceted approach that goes on one end from the kinetic action of last resort to the other end of the spectrum, which is the softer side of the prevention aspect, which is addressing the drivers of marginalization. Canada is working across the continent to build on the local expertise and capacities across the full range of activities in this space. We have the Canadian military that's providing training and equipment and technical assistance through to several of the countries that are here today. And soon we hope that will also be expanded into Kenya. While they are focusing on hard security, of course, they are ensuring that human rights and rule of law are respected. We're also working with police and border forces to increase the capacity to detect, deter, and respond to violent extremist activities. Through our partnerships with many of your countries, we have assisted in strengthening local laws and judiciary to improve the prosecution outcomes in terrorist cases. We've also worked with the financial sector so that controls have been implemented to reduce funding to violent extremist organizations and other criminal organizations. Additionally, Canada has looked at our development assistance and has worked to ensure that it's focused on reducing the local drivers that lead to radicalization. And this includes improving access to education, improving access to vocational skills, opening up employment opportunities, working on social cohesion, and building community resilience. Building on our great partnership with Algeria in the West Africa Working Group of the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, we are now looking forward in September to taking on the co-chairship with Morocco of the full GCTF. And we're looking forward to continuing the well-established record of innovation and further strengthening its collaboration on counterterrorism with the UN system and on the continent. We know that our discussion today and continuing over tomorrow will enhance our understanding of the terrorism threats faced by African countries, share good practices, share lessons learned, and build on all of our efforts so that we can secure a more prosperous, safe, and secure continent. I thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. My next speaker is UNDP.
ها هنا Asia Kwa, Assistant Administrator and Director for UNDP Regional Bureau of Africa. Donc on passe au second.
Move on to the next speaker, Haki Africa, Executive Director. You have the floor.
On passe au suivant.
Move on to the next speaker, Human Security Collective, Jan Abdullah, Program Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Your Excellencies and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the African Regional High-Level Conference on Prevention of Violent Extremism highlights the importance of enhancing the resilience of young people from vulnerable communities. The intervention relates specifically to a question posed in Session 2: how can youth be engaged to prevent violent extremism in Africa? As Human Security Collective, a Dutch civil society organization working on the nexus between development and security at home and in international contexts, we work, amongst others, in the field of education, learning by doing, peer-to-peer exchange to prevent youth from radicalization. More than any other generation, young people these days are exposed online to peers with the widest possible range of cultural backgrounds, beliefs, values, and perspectives. This, however, has not necessarily led to increased social cohesion. On the contrary, information bubbles and echo chambers enforce the us versus them thinking, populism, hate speech, etc. It is therefore important to reach out to teenagers who take part in antisocial group behavior with role models, mentors. These mentors are trusted and respected by these teenagers as they are from the same vulnerable neighborhoods. They model the sort of behavior we want to see off and online: citizenship values, respect for diversity, dignity, non-violent communication, and empathy. These mentors facilitate safe space for teenagers to talk about grievances, and together with teenagers, they analyze what safety in their neighborhoods looks like. It is about perceptions of safety by kids themselves, as their insights are crucial in understanding the complexity of radicalization. These mentors implement creative and energetic activities together with teenagers and other community members to improve social cohesion as a way to rehumanize, re-socialize vulnerable group behavior. In essence, this type of role modeling is about embracing diversity to work towards a society that everyone feels they belong to, instilling the notion of global citizenship. It is the interplay among youth and between youth and the larger community and the change engendered by these relationships that is at the core of this mentorship. These inclusive leadership skills practiced by these mentors are much needed at every level of intervention we are currently discussing. If you are interested to learn more specifically about two tailor-made approaches on mentorship in Tunisia and in Kenya, in which good practices and lessons learned are showcased, we welcome you at our side event tomorrow morning from 7:45 to 9:15 in room 11. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. We've come to the end of the list of speakers. I'd like to thank everyone that's spoken for their varied experiences and their interesting comments. We have to continue to combat terrorism in a coordinated and harmonious manner, and the same applies to violent extremism.
After the list of speakers for today is completed, I will open the floor for those member states who had not ascribed and want to speak today. However, we will need to close this session by 6 p.m. to attend the reception jointly hosted by Mr. Monica Juma, Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs of Kenya, and UN Under Secretary General for Counter-Terrorism, Mr. Vladimir Voronkov. Thank you.
If there are any member states that want to take the floor, we still have some time until 6 p.m. when we need to finish to hear more speakers. So if anyone would like to take the floor, please do so. If no one wishes to take the floor, I will give the floor back to my co-chair to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you will agree with me that it has been an extremely enriching session, and that what we can really acknowledge is that the African countries, African continent is really determined, is really engaged, is really committed, not only just to fight against extremism and counter-terrorism, but at the same time to use all kind of mechanism, instrument, going to the grassroots of the problems, trying to understand the origin of this radicalization, and trying to work together with not only international organizations, but of course with all kind of partners that can provide answer to this common tragedy, common plight. So I think we have listened to most of you with a specific proposal, good practices. I was very impressed by the specificity of some of the comments and really concrete initiative. And I think that that's going to be a very positive, let's say, common understanding for the future. So I think both co-chairs, my friend from Tunisia and myself from the United Nations Alliance of Civilization, combine these two attitudes. One is, of course, working daily basis in Tunisia in order to really try to perform and achieve the elimination of any risk and threat of terrorism. And me in the United Nations working with my friend Vladimir Voronkov, UNOACT, to try to develop this soft diplomacy that can be necessary in order that all together we can defeat these fanatics. So thank you very much. Thank you for all the panelists. Thank you for all the intervenants. And I think we will go for the third session tomorrow with concrete proposal, with good experiences, and I think I have to thank all of you for the important achievement of this session. Yeah? Sorry? Well, I think it's finished, no? Tomorrow.
Dear distinguished delegates, just a point of information, there is an official reception which is starting in a few minutes at the big tent immediately. If you come out of the entrance here and turn right and walk down the stairs, you'll see a big white tent. And you are all invited. This is a reception hosted by Her Excellency, the Foreign Minister of Kenya, Dr. Monica Juma, and Under Secretary General Voronkov of UNOCT. So you are all invited, and you are invited to please proceed to the reception in the tent immediately after the conclusion of this meeting. Thank you.